You finish your quilt top, now what? Today we're going to talk all things quilt finishing. There's so many videos out there about piecing and putting together quilt tops, but really when you're ready to move past that, there's not a lot of info out there. And so today we thought we would show you the whole process of what we go through to finish our quilts and give you some pointers here and there on different things you can do, especially for those of you that are new to quilting. First up, we're going to talk about quilt backs and batting. Oftentimes out there's a lot of information about whether you pre-wash your fabrics or you don't pre-wash your fabrics. And really, if you've pre-washed the front of your quilt, you probably should pre-wash the back of your quilt before you do the sandwiching. We often don't pre-wash the front of our quilts because the quality of the fabric has changed over the years and it's a lot nicer now, so you don't really have to worry about that. And so that means that you really don't have to worry about pre-washing your quilt back either. For your quilt backing, you need to make sure that your backing fabric is at least 6 inches all the way around your quilt top. So if you had a 50-inch square quilt, then you would want to make sure that your backing was about 60 inches square. That way you have plenty of room to use it on your quilts. And as you move around, that tends to kind of bunch and twist. And so having a little bit bigger to work with is great. Oftentimes that means that with a normal piece of fabric that's about 45 inches wide, you're going to have to put 2 of those widths together. And at some quilt shops, you can buy fabric in 108-inch wide pieces, but depending on your project, that may be just too big of a piece to use, or you just may not have that option. When you're putting your quilt backing together and you're sewing on that seam, what I like to do is take the selvage of both of our pieces of fabric and line up that selvage edge together. And then you want to sew about 1/4 inch in or 1/2 inch in from the selvage. You never want to leave the selvage on your quilt backing. It doesn't have the same stretch as the rest of your fabric does and can cause problems. So you want to make sure that you're sewing out away from that selvage about 1/4 or 1/2 inch. And with the selvage, it's pretty straight, so it gives you kind of that nice line to go down and piece that backing together. The other thing, a lot of people like to open their seams on their piecing, and on our back, we typically leave it pressed to one side or the other. That way, if there's any kind of tension problems with our machine, as we have it on the back, if you have that seam opened, you can see the batting through it sometimes, and by pressing it to one side, it kind of covers that up if there's any problems. So that's the way you want to prepare your quilt back before you get started. And then for your batting to go with your project, we like for it to be at least 3 inches bigger than the top of our quilt. So if we had a 50-inch square, we would make it about 53 inches. If it comes in a bigger piece than that, what we try to do is just go ahead and sandwich our quilt together first and get the quilting done, and then trim after. The same thing goes with your back. Don't do any trimming before you get it quilted, just wait till after. That way you make sure you have nice big pieces to work with, and then after you can trim it down and use the leftovers for maybe another project. Let's talk batting for just a quick second. There are a few different types out there. We carry Warm and Natural and Bamboo here at my shop, but there's lots of different battings and lots of great options out there. Batting normally comes in a few distinct sizes. One of them, for Warm and Natural, they come in 124 inches wide. And so if you're doing a large quilt, that's awesome because you have 124 inches to work with. A king quilt is normally about 108 to 110 inches, and so that would be plenty wide for a king size quilt. You can also get Warm and Natural in like 96 inches wide, which is more standard, and so you have that option as well. And Warm and Natural is a cotton blend that we like to use, and it's probably one of the most known types of batting that we have out there. It works great. It has the scrim that we need that kind of holds that tension together. You want to make sure that you're using a decent quality batting in your projects. You've worked so hard to get the top together, and you want something that's going to last on the inside of your quilts. The other type that we carry is bamboo. Bamboo is a little bit softer in its feel and in its weight, and it's also a really great option along with Warm and Natural, and it is comes in 90 inches wide for that, and it comes from Pellin normally. But there's lots of options out there that you can use, Dreamweaver, some other products. Just make sure that you have the batting big enough to cover your project, and that you're looking for one that has some quality to it so it doesn't break down before your quilt and have little lumps in your quilt before you're ready for that. Bamboo is a little bit softer than our Warm and Natural. It can be used in little quilts for babies. If you like a purely cotton quilt, then the Warm and Natural also works for that. One more thing before we move on to the next steps. If you have directional fabric for your backing, just make sure that you have it laid the way you want it to on your quilt and that you have enough to cover. Sometimes that means that you'll have a vertical seam instead of a horizontal seam through your quilt, but just watch if you're using directional fabric for your backing. Now that you have your quilt back ready to go, we're ready to talk about actually sandwiching all of our layers together. And one thing that I wanted to mention before you move on to that step, on your quilt front, one thing that you might consider doing is either serging around the outside edge or even doing like a straight stitch about an 1/8 inch in from the sides. What that does for you is oftentimes as quilters, we don't use the back stitch. And so when we get out here to the outside edges, these seams can all try to pull loose as we're trying to quilt. And if you will just take and do a straight stitch around the whole quilt, or if you have a serger, the serger works even better. And that helps hold all of those little seams together while we're quilting. Here I have my layers kind of laid out for you. So let's talk through what I have here prepared. One thing that you might consider doing, oftentimes when we're trying to lay all these layers together and keep them all nice and flat and straight, is to take your backing fabric and actually use painter's tape and tape it to a surface like a table or your floor or something like that. You can also take, if you have carpet in your house, and take your backing and lay it out on the carpet and actually pin your backing to the carpet. The problem is just making sure that this stays really nice and tight because we can't see it with the other layers on top of it. But painter's tape on a table works really great. Then you're gonna add your batting on top of that. One thing to note about batting is that it does have a right and a wrong side. Oftentimes with this, it has the scrim on the back and it kind of feels bumpy. And we like for it to be on the bottom. That way it pulls all those fibers to the back side as we're quilting, instead of pulling them up to the front and leaving the little kind of fuzz all across the top of our quilt. So I have my batting laid on top of my backing with the bumpy side facing down towards the backing. Then you're gonna take your quilt top and you're gonna get it laid on there, making sure that you're kind of nice and square with your backing. This is also why we like for our backing to be larger than the quilt top. That way you have a little bit of room to ooch and scooch to get plenty of room around it to make sure that all the layers are gonna fit together. So I have that laid out on top, and now we're ready to go about pinning our quilt together. Before I show you pinning our layers together, I also wanted to note here that you can extend your tape out on the sides so you can really see where the edge of your quilt's gonna be, and make sure that your quilt top is moved over far enough that you're inside of those pieces. When it comes to pinning, what the general measure is to make sure that you have a safety pin about a hand's distance away from each other. Today with our quilt, it's kind of nice because if we just kind of put a pin in each one of our blocks, we have plenty of pinning. But if you have kind of a different look, then you're just kind of laying your hand out and putting a pin about a hand's distance away from each other, and you're gonna pin the entire top of your quilt that way. With the safety pins, just have it open, and then you can just pick up all 3 layers and then come back out and close it. And you're just going to keep doing that till you have all of your quilt top pinned together. Before we move on to the actual quilting of our sandwich, we need to make sure that we have a pin in every one of our blocks, or about a hand's distance away on the entire quilt top. It's really important that you make sure and add enough pins so that as we're quilting, we don't have puckers or pleats on our back. This is really meant to hold everything nice and smooth together through the whole process. Another option for sandwiching your quilt is actually to do spray basting. And our preferred spray baste is the 505 temporary spray. What we like about it is it holds the quilt together long enough to get your project done, but then it easily washes out after that, so it doesn't leave that adhesive in your quilt. So when you're spray basting, what you do is you kind of move to the middle of your quilt and pull most of your quilt back away. And I'm on the backing right now. You can work this backing and batting together and then get all that together and then come back over it with your quilt top. But again, you're kind of just taking the middle of your quilt and you're kind of starting there. And then I'm using either paper or freezer paper is one of my favorite things to use. And you're kind of laying it outside your quilt back so that you have some space to overspray, because that's one of the other things you really have to watch with spray basting, is that there's kind of this overspray and you don't want your floor or your table sticky after the fact. So I really like to use freezer paper mostly and lay that out on the sides because it's nice and wide, and I have the paper side up so that nothing sticks to it. And so you want to make sure of that, and then you're just kind of spraying in one piece. Just do about a foot or 2 out away from you, and then you're going to take your batting. I have both my layers, but I would work my batting first and then my quilt top on top of that. You're going to spray about a foot out away from you, and then you're just going to take that batting and you're going to lay it kind of nice and gentle on top of it. And then you're just going to come in and like really rub that smooth in that portion. And then you'll pick up your batting and see where it's not stuck. Okay, just kind of where it's not stuck. And then you spray again about a foot, and then you're just continuing to work that out away from you. After you get the batting attached to your backing, then you come in the same idea, kind of start in the middle of your quilt, spray about a foot or so, and then bring that quilt top over the top of it, lay it nice and gentle out across so that it's flat, and then you're just pressing it down to make sure that it's kind of stuck together and you're working your way out. The nice thing about spray basting is that you don't have to use any pins to hold it together, and you get kind of this nice area. If you don't have a walking foot too, this does really help with that because it'll keep your layers together a little bit better. One thing that you need to make sure and watch is that when you're spray basting, you need that adhesion to dry before you go over to your sewing machine. You don't want to get any of that sticky adhesive on your needle because it gets drug into the insides of your sewing machine, which could be kind of bad. So it's nice that you have all the layers together, but you just need to take those extra precautions of having something outside your quilt so that you have the overspray, and that you're making sure that you let it dry really good before you take it to your sewing machine. With the 505 spray, since it is temporary, it only lasts for so long too. So you need to make sure that you're doing it in a time when over a few days period, you could get the quilting done because it kind of loses its strength over time and it's not sticky enough if you leave it and then come back to it later. Now that we have our sandwich made, we're ready to actually do the stitching of our quilt together. And I wanted to talk about a couple of options that you have when you get to this step. So one of the things that people often look for is free motion quilting. And in free motion quilting, what you're doing is actually dropping the feed dogs down on your sewing machine so that you have free range to move like side to side and kind of glide across. That takes a lot of practice to get really good at that. And today I'm going to show you some ways that you can get your quilt top together even if you don't have the skills of free motion quilting down yet. One thing that would be very helpful is if you had a walking foot. A walking foot kind of gives us feed dogs not only on the bottom but on the top. That way all the layers are pulled together as we're moving it through the machine. And we can also look at some ways of marking or using our foot to our advantage so that we can kind of get these echo quilting or different designs on our quilt top. So let's take a look at a few options. Before we move over to the sewing machine to get a little bit of quilting done on our top, I wanted to talk just a quick minute about free motion quilting and why I don't really think it's the best option for a new quilter. With free motion quilting, what we have to watch out for is the fact that our sewing machines don't have stitch regulators. Long arm machines, the big ones that do the quilting for us, have a regulator on the machine, and so if we go fast, it goes fast with us so that the stitches stay consistently the same length. On a domestic machine, like your sewing machine at home, as we move fast, we take a long stitch, and then if you slow down, you take a little stitch. So with free motion quilting, the big deal is making sure that you're learning to stay consistent with your speed as you're moving under that needle to make that pattern look better. And if you get really good at it, that's awesome. It's a really fun skill to have. But as a new quilter, it's often one of the first things that people tell you to go and try, and it's really frustrating when you realize that it's going to take a lot more work to get good at it. So today I'm just going to show you how to straight line stitch with your walking foot to get our quilt together. I'm going to show you a few different ways that you can actually get your quilt top together that would make it look really nice and professional without the hassle of learning free motion quilting in a moment's time. So really the first thing that you go to if you've ever tried to start quilting is to stitch on the lines itself. And we call that stitching in the ditch. And you can get feet for your walking foot or your standard sewing foot that are called stitch in the ditch feet. And they have this guide out in front that you line up with those seams and you walk down that seam line. I will tell you, stitching in the ditch, which is often what people tell you to refer to, is probably a little bit harder than you realize. It's really hard to stay exactly in that seam all the way down. Another option you could do is actually just stay to the right or left of your seams, maybe a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch, or even just the width of your foot. The whole point is that you have a way to stay straight. And so if you can use the side of your foot to stay straight, that's awesome. And it looks a little bit better if you just stitch down both sides of your seams. You can also get what's called a quilting bar, and a quilting bar slides into the back side of the walking foot. And that gives you the way to have lines that are the same distance apart as you go down. So you can definitely use the seam as one of them, but for every one of the marks, what you're doing is lining up that quilt bar with the line you sewed before, and then echoing that all the way across. So you get these very symmetric lines all the way across your quilt. Another thing that I like to do is to actually quilt across the diagonals of the blocks. And so just taking a ruler and maybe a marking device like a chalk line like this one, and actually just drawing lines from point to point all the way across your quilt. It looks really nice on a quilt that's blocks like this one. And you can even get a little bit more creative with like a circle template or another, maybe a plate or something that you have, and actually tracing around that circle. So going on one side of the circle and then moving it to the other side, and that gives you kind of that wave look out across the quilt. All of those options give you a great way to finish your quilt and have it look the way you want it to. You put so much work into that quilt top and you want to finish it nicely, but oftentimes you don't really know how to go about that. And all of these are some great options that are not difficult to do, that give you that look, and you get to finish your quilt and have a really nice project in the end. One thing to note before you actually do the quilting of your quilt is to make sure that you lengthen your stitch. Most of the time we piece at 2 or 2.5, and for our quilting, I'm gonna set that to a 3. Everybody thinks that the stitches are about how long your stitches are, and actually it's how much thread's being let out each time. And because we have a thicker set with the sandwich, we need more thread to be let out before the next time around. If it's too short, sometimes you'll have jump stitches where it doesn't actually grab. So I'm going to change this to a 3 before I actually do the stitching. Here I have my standard sewing foot, my general purpose foot, and I wanted to show you a couple of things about it. If you don't have a walking foot to put on your machine, you can use your standard foot, but I want you to watch one thing as we sew. On the edge of our quilt, it may be beneficial to either tack or backstitch just a little bit on those seams, just to make sure that you're grabbing as we go across. And then with this foot, what we have to be really careful of is that we're not pushing this quilt too fast and making it bunch in front of the needle. That's what will make it pleat or bunch on the front of our quilts. So you have to really be slow and let the machine pull the quilt through on its own so that you don't pleat the top. When we have a walking foot, we have those extra feed dogs on the top and it'll pull it all together. But when you're using a standard foot, you want to just take your time and make sure that you're not pushing it too much, that it's bunching here in front of your presser foot. And what I'm doing here is stitching in the ditch, and so I'm staying just in line with those 2 blocks. And oftentimes, because of the way we pressed our block one way or the other, you kind of get a high side and a low side. And so I always try to stay just on the inside right here, but have my needle be on the lower side of that seam. It seems to stitch a little bit better and stay more against that edge nicer. What you often see when you're new, you're struggling to keep it straight, and you'll see the stitches come out on one block and then they'll go onto the next block and back. And that just takes practice to get better at stitching in the ditch. But one thing to watch is just kind of staying on that low side as we come across here. And then at this next block, because I nested, this is my lower side. And so I'm gonna make sure I stay towards this one on that block. And with the quilt, you just have all of this bulk that you have to work with. And so you're trying to keep it up on the table so that it's not pulling against your needle. You can also get gloves that you can wear that have kind of a rubbery bottom on them, and it gives you more grip too, so you have a little bit more control if you struggle to keep your quilt top kind of managed. So then as I come up on that intersection, I'm gonna make sure that I keep my needle more towards the lower side and switch and kind of go on this side of that block. I'm really having to slow down and make sure that I'm smoothing as I go so that it doesn't bunch in front of my needle. And make sure that you're trying to keep your quilt nice and straight across here as it's moving, and that you're not letting this drag down in front of it, because that'll make it hard to stay straight. On my very next row, what I need to do is actually turn my quilt around and have the end where I stopped be the beginning of the next row. You want to make sure and alternate your quilt as you go down each row. If you don't, it starts making these little lines on the back of your quilt where you've gone in the same direction and pushed the fabric all in the same direction. And so for each row, wherever you ended, you're going to turn your quilt around, and the beginning of the next one will be on that side, and then you go down. So you just kind of go up and go down and then go up and then down. And you work that all the way across your quilt in one direction. I've switched to my walking foot for this row. I wanted to show you the difference that we get by using a walking foot. Most standard sewing machines have walking feet that you can buy for them, and we'll get to see with the extra set of feed dogs on the top how much nicer it pulls down as we sew. And here on this walking foot, I have my stitch in the ditch attachment plate, and that allows me to have this nice leg out in front of me that guides me on my stitching. One other thing before we get started, because I'm coming down this direction this time, most of the quilt is in the neck of my machine, and all you have to do is just kind of take and burrito roll it back underneath itself so that it'll fit into the neck space of your sewing machine. And that keeps that nice and rolled out of the way so that you can focus on stitching straight on your line. When we're using our walking foot, I don't have to have my hands on it as much because it's really doing a great job of pulling all of those fabrics together as it moves down that stitch line. So I actually am able to have my hands further back away and have a hold of my quilt a little bit better here so that I'm not having to really watch that it's staying smooth out in front. Okay, and again, as you kind of move down your quilt, you just need to make sure that you're keeping it kind of even so that you don't have it pulling one way or another. It really helps too for this step if you can have your sewing machine set on a bigger table so that you have all of that space for your quilt to lay out behind your machine so that it doesn't bunch up so badly. Okay, I've tacked it, cut my threads, and again, we're going to turn our quilt around and come back the other direction for that next stitch. Before we move on to finishing up our quilt and getting it nice and square and ready for binding, I wanted to show you what it looked like to use your quilting bar. Some of the walking feet have the capability of using a quilting bar that rides in the back of the foot, and it gives you a guide so that you can stay straight. So one way I could have quilted this quilt, instead of doing stitch in the ditch, I could have laid my quilting bar in the ditch each time and then actually quilted out here away from it on all the different sides. And that gives us a little bit of spacing. It often looks a little nicer too because you're not trying your best to ride the line, you're staying out away from it. And so the idea is that you take the quilting bar and you just keep it here in the ditch while you're stitching out here away from it down the quilt. And then that way you don't have to do all the marking of the quilt. If you don't have a quilting bar, all you need to do is use your marking pin or some painter's tape and just draw those lines down your quilt, and you're going to follow those as well. Now that we have all of the quilting done on our project, we're all excited that we made it through that piece of it. And before we get ready for our binding, we have to square up our quilt. And I thought I'd show you how I do that with a really long ruler. So this one is a 6x24 and a good rotary cutter that'll cut through all the layers. But let's take a look at that before we move on to binding. As I'm working to square up my quilt, one thing that I'm really noting here is that I kind of have these lines going on in the quilt top, and that's where I use that standard foot on my sewing machine. It really kind of caused it to kind of drag versus on this next row where I use that walking foot and it doesn't have that same kind of feature. That's why on this one, it's really important that we, go down one side and then come back on the other side and then go up so that this doesn't continue all the way out across our quilt, but we kind of have it going back and forth and smoothing out. But that is one of the big advantages of using a walking foot. When you go to square up your quilt, what you're going to do is just pick one of your sides, and we're using that long ruler because we want as far along as we can get down the sides of it. And oftentimes it's going to just be a little bit off out here. You want to make sure that you can stay straight. And so on my quilt, what I can do is just make sure that I'm keeping my ruler against this set of blocks. And when we look at our cross sections, we can make sure that we're kind of keeping the lines straight on those as well. Here on this one, I'm just going to take off that little bitty bit here to show you. You can get even closer to that as well, and then just keep an eye out here. These blocks are a little bit bigger, so I have to really watch. And when you're talking about keeping it straight on the ruler on both sides. It doesn't have to be perfectly straight. This is more of it looks straight when we look at it. So if you're off by a little bit, you're okay. Just do your best to stay as straight as you can and have the long sections as straight as they can be. So I'm just going to take and trim off that piece out here to the end. And then on the end of my batting, I can just take and break it apart so that I can move on to the next side. But you're just going to work your way down the side just like that. When you get to a corner, we're going to turn and work that next side. And because we're trying to stay as square as we can be, we're going to take one of the lines of our ruler and make sure that it's straight on the side that we just trimmed. That way we can make that 90-degree angle for our corner here. And you may have to pull your quilt back and forth just to make sure that you're keeping that same distance out across it. So here I'm trying to stay straight here, and then I'm doing my best to make sure that I'm staying straight out here too. And there we're going to take and trim up that next side. And then I'm inching my hands down as I go out across it to make sure that my ruler doesn't shift side to side. So my ruler is always kind of behind my hand, and then I move out in front of it and keep cutting. That way this ruler does not move side to side. And then after I've got to all of this work, have this be kind of wonky as we walk down. Then here what we can do is just kind of pull that towards us. Again, working that out in front of us. The studio, it's a little tight, but you'll have more room on a bigger table. And then again, kind of starting back here where you know you were straight, making sure that we're staying straight all the way out across it, and then going again. I try to leave myself 3 or 4 inches down here to make sure that I'm staying straight enough with the piece that I cut, and then making sure again that I'm watching some of these spots on my ruler to make sure that I'm staying as square as I can be. So we'll do that all the way around our quilt, and we'll have it ready for binding. And there we have our quilt squared and quilted. I know that you're super excited to get it to this point. I know I always am, to have that sandwich done. And then you have that one last piece of quilt binding. And we actually have a video on quilt binding, and you'll find that information in the description below. Thank you so much for joining us this time, and we hope you join us again real soon. If you liked what you saw today, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel. And if you want to receive those notifications, make sure you click on the bell icon. Thanks for letting us turn your inspiration into a creation.